We've already talked about what the original Islamic sources have to say about slavery, but now this video is all about the history and what actually happened under the various khilafas. We'll also be juxtaposing the position of slaves in other ancient civilizations that existed during the time and even thousands of years before Islam even emerged out of the Hijaz.
After the Prophet's death, the Islamic Empire was expanding very rapidly, and the sheer number of conquests created a surplus of slaves.
We drew out two ideas in the last video that are often repeated by apologists. The first is that Islam gave slaves rights for the first time, and the second is that Islam institutionalized the concept of freeing slaves.
We saw how this wasn't accurate even if you just look at theology. But let's look deeper now and take a look at the historical data on Islamic history and other ancient civilizations.
Imtiaz, while other cultures, religions, people were treating slaves like animals, Islam came in and gave them rights for the first time. We moved from Jahiliyyah days of putting rocks on slaves, whipping them and prostituting them, into enshrining slave rights within the religion.
One common idea is that Islam laid down certain ground rules about slavery, regulating it and ensuring certain rights for slaves. Many even say that the Islamic empires were the first to lay down rights for slaves. Some take it even further and argue that being a slave in the Islamic empires was nothing more than being like a servant.
On the first point, there is truth to the idea that Islam institutionalized certain rights for slaves, and we'll discuss that later. But what's more important here is that Islam was not the first religion or system to discuss slave rights. For example, in letters called On Master and Slave by a man called Seneca, he talks about treating slaves as our fellow man, which included masters dining with their slaves.
Now, the idea of dining with slaves is something that, it's one of the positive things that you can find in hadith, which talk about feeding slaves what you eat and clothing them in what you have. But the key point here is that Seneca didn't live 100 years or thousands of years after Muhammad. In fact, he was a Stoic philosopher who lived 500 years before Muhammad was even born. It's also easy to pick up a copy of the Code of Ur-Nammu or the Code of Lipit-Ishtar, both of which are some of the earliest laws known to mankind, existing 2,600 years and 2,400 years before Islam even existed.
Like some of the laws within Islam regarding slavery and concubinage, these extremely ancient laws are far from perfect, and many would be considered very inhumane today. However, they did legislate what could and could not be done to slaves.
For example, some ancient cuneiform tablets include laws regarding slave rights around buying their freedom. Just like these ancient civilizations, there were good and bad things in the Islamic world when it came to slavery.
There are stories about Umar ibn al-Khattab summoning the ruler of Egypt, Amr ibn al-As at the time, because his son was being disrespectful to his slave. But there are similarly stories of Umar ibn al-Khattab demanding slave women never to dress like free women. And it was actually under Umar's authority that Arab armies in Egypt invaded Black Africa to the south and tried to conquer the Christian Makurians living there at the time.
Although the Muslims were held off in the first and second battles of Dongola, the Makurians had to sign a treaty or Baqt to prevent further invasions. The most important term in this Baqt was an annual payment of 360 high-quality African slaves. The treaty stood for 700 years without opposition from generations and generations of Islamic ulama, clerics, and scholars. But we'll talk more on the slave trade in Africa later.
Okay, fine. So concepts around slave-related laws were found in empires thousands of years before Islam. But what about actually freeing slaves? Islam was the first to encourage freeing slaves.
This is a very common idea, and sometimes it's even argued, mostly by sort of current day Western Islamic theologians, that Islam was the first abolitionist movement. So yeah, Islam did place a lot of emphasis on freeing slaves, as we talked about in the first video. However, the concept of freeing slaves was also found in all the empires, the ancient empires surrounding the Hijaz and the Islamic empires. For example, throughout the history of Rome, in the Byzantine empires, and even going as far back as the earliest civilizations in the world, as we know it, Mesopotamia.
We've dug out some of the Neo-Sumerian records showing slaves being binded in contracts where they are automatically freed when their owners become old. A similar concept can be found in Islamic hadith, but these hadiths came into existence more than 2,500 years later.
The code of the Neo-Sumerian king Lipit-Ishtar from 860 BC even made sure that under threat of law, freed slaves were kept free and not re-enslaved. In fact, during the Qin dynasty in China, the emperor, and I always try to say this, but the Emperor Wang Mang, I think that's his name, I'm not butchering it, actually abolished slavery when he took the throne.
Well, what about the fact that slaves freed by Muslims sometimes kept living with their masters? If it was that bad, why would they stay? Muhammad's own adopted son, Zayd, used to be a slave.
That's true. Muhammad's son, Zayd ibn Haritha, was his slave at one point. And again, we find this in other ancient civilizations too, including, yet again, the Neo-Sumerian times. There are written records showing that freed slaves sometimes remained in the master's household, and that they were actually eligible for inheritance of property. Now that's quite progressive for the Neo-Sumerians, and let's not forget, that's more than 4,000 years old.
Furthermore, these records show that courts upheld the freedom rights of slaves. For example, in the case of Ursagab, who along with his children was freed from slavery within a court system and returned to being a free citizen.
In fact, in the late Roman Republic, freed slaves become libertus or libertà and were even given political freedom, the right to vote.
Freed slaves could also find themselves inheriting their previous master's property if they chose to join their family. So you can understand why many did that. This is actually the same thing that happened 700 years later with the Prophet's ex-slave turned adopted son, Zayd ibn Haritha.
Okay. Perhaps slave rights and the idea that freeing slaves was good is something that we find in all ancient empires, fine. But with Islam, we saw the first time there was an institutional attempt to abolish slavery. Without slavery, it's so tied up within the economy that to end it within Muhammad's lifetime was impossible.
This is a very common thing that we hear, and this leads us to what academics call the paradox of Islamic slavery. Why, when freedom for slaves was promoted within Islamic texts, did the practice of slavery grow so large and became so institutionalized within every single Islamic caliphate, from the first 4 Khalifas all the way to the Ottomans? According to Kitab al-Tabaqat al-Kabir, an acclaimed historical book, Uthman ibn Affan, the 3rd Muslim Khalifa, died leaving behind 1,000 slaves.
So why did slavery become so integral to the Islamic Empire's economy that people became wealthy just by buying and selling slaves? Slave markets could even be found in the holiest of cities for Muslims, Mecca and Medina. We were actually really shocked when we first came across this, but do the research yourself.
A similar situation can be seen in the earlier Roman empires, where slaves had certain rights and certain concepts existed around their freedom, like libertas. These rights, however, were not to end slavery, but to control and institutionalize it within an empire. The way slavery was institutionalized into Islam theologically can be seen in which areas the Islamic empires got their slaves from.
You see, Muslims were not really allowed to take slaves from local sources. For example, you can't take another Muslim as a slave. Fun fact, this is actually very similar to the early Zoroastrian religions, which were found in Persia, where a Zoroastrian could not take another Zoroastrian as a slave. Furthermore, due to the large numbers of freed slaves and the legal protection to the non-Muslim dhimmis living within the Islamic Empire, the pool of people that could be taken as slaves from domestic sources was very limited.
This meant that the extremely high demand for slaves could only be satisfied through war, prisoners of war, or buying slaves. We know that the buying and selling of slaves was a huge economy in all Islamic empires. In fact, there are hadith where Muhammad himself traded slaves, although mostly for non-financial reasons.
One of the biggest places where the Islamic empires got their slaves from was the African continent. And as we saw earlier with Umar's attack on Christian Makuria, this was right from the beginning of Islam. According to Dr. John Alambilla Azuma's book, The Legacy of Arab Islam in Africa, which I've got here, it's an amazing book. Approximately 17 million Africans were taken into the Islamic Empire as slaves. Most of them were black women and children, as you can imagine, because of the prisoners of war concept. Many were brought out of Africa by Islamic traders, in comparison to the 11 million that were taken out by the Europeans in the very horrific transatlantic slave trade.
And just like the transatlantic trade, we're not sure exactly how many died en route. Dr. Alambilla estimates that over 80 million Africans died on their way to slave masters and slave markets in the Islamic Empire.
But Nourhan, comparing the transatlantic chattel slavery to the Islamic slavery makes no sense. In the former, in transatlantic slavery, slaves were not even treated like human beings. They were objects, they were property. And slaves within the Islamic Empire, however, were treated like full human beings.
This is mostly true, but again, this is true for most ancient forms of slavery. Transatlantic slavery was unique in that it used racial constructs to dehumanize slaves, something most academics believe didn't happen in older empires that took slaves. However, this isn't to say that slaves under Islam or other ancient civilizations were treated like normal people or even servants. Academics have referred to these slaves as being human beings with extremely limited rights, completely dependent on their masters who had the right to buy and sell them like property.
We often forget that slaves went through what's called extreme displacement and how extreme displacement actually affected them. It isn't just about physical torture. So what may appear as relatively mild bondage for the enslaved within any society may look more like a plunge into disorientation, deprivation, and degradation.
How slaves were treated, the rights they were given, how large slave trading grew in an empire depended on many things: its economics, its kings or khalifa, its religious and civil laws. You can see similarities between Islam and other ancient empires and religions all over the place.
Ashoka, the Buddhist ruler, inscribed in stone his injunctions to cease slave trading and treated slaves decently. Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, I think it's called the Achaemenid Empire, had quite liberal views on slavery too. Now, we've obviously come a very long way since then. Today, the Declaration of Human Rights states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That's Article 1. And that no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. That's Article 4.
The Islamic Declaration of Human Rights also abhors slavery, and the laws in all Muslim countries prohibit the practice of slavery. However, this change in the Muslim world happened much later than most people realize.
There were slave markets in Saudi, in Yemen, in Egypt, all across the Muslim world, in fact, as late as the 1800s. There are even contracts from the early last century showing the exchange of slaves.
In Saudi Arabia, slavery wasn't officially banned until 1962. In Mauritania, it was so deeply rooted in society that it wasn't until 2007 that the government finally passed a law allowing slave holders to be persecuted.
The current kafala system in Saudi Arabia, where migrant workers are forced to give their passports, is sometimes thought of as modern-day slavery. Some people go as far as to say that workers in factories, in sweatshops, in many parts of the world, whether you're talking about Bangladesh or China or whatever, might even be worse off than slaves from ancient empires.
But horrendous working conditions are not exactly the same as slavery. Wage slavery is horrific, but it's not the same as being owned property, so it's important to be careful and not to stamp all over the abuses that slaves in transatlantic trade and more ancient forms went through, while obviously continuing to fight for the rights of people being economically exploited today.
And the problem is that as long as we have unfair economics, which will be for a very long time, I imagine, there will always be an incentive to exploit others. So we have to tackle the ideological justification to slavery in religion, or we just won't be able to kiss slavery goodbye. Unfortunately, we do see a minority of Muslims who do defend practices such as concubinage, but the vast majority of Muslims today find slavery absolutely abhorrent. And the purpose of this video is not to imply in any shape or form that Muslims accept slavery, because they really don't.
But as part of being honest with ourselves, it's very important to learn to critically examine our history and traditional theological positions, and it's never as black and white as it's presented. Thanks a lot, guys. We're going to comment below with the books that we like in this area, both theological and contemporary academic stuff. Let us know how these videos made you feel or think in the comment section below. And if you've learned something new, share this video with your fellow nerds.
So that's it from us. Until next time, goodbye.
Bye.